Hello, Anne. How are you? Good to
I'm
see you.
Ursula. I'm good. I'm good.
Hi, I'm Ursula, and I'm here with my partner, business partner, and best friend, Anne. And we are Ursula and Anne from Be Above Leadership. And so today we're gonna tell a story.
Well, we're going to talk about stories. We might tell some stories on the way, but
Yep.
we're going to talk about telling stories in coaching, having the client tell stories, telling stories as the
Mm.
coach. And I want to start with that. I was originally told in coaching school 22 years ago, don't let your client get into the story. You're
Yeah.
not coaching the story, you're coaching the client. So let's talk about like what's right about that. And then let's talk about where we need to push beyond it. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was told exactly the same thing, even to the degree where, oh, it's just your story. Oh, it's just your story. It became sort of a negative thing. It became something to really stay away from.
Yeah. And I think what we've discovered, coaches all these years, and particularly we'll talk more about this in working with trauma, is that there's a time and a place for stories. But let's start with, like I said, what's true about why would we not like, why and when, Ursula, do you feel like you do want to kind of intrude in a client's story?
Well, in my experience, there is a certain quality to the story that, as a coach, I'm listening to. If the story begins to be very sort of blamey, repetitive, sort of almost reinforcing something that they're actually not wanting, but falling back into the same narrative, that is when really I want to ask the question, well, what is this really about? And also there is a length of telling a story. It's one thing when you have a 3 or 4 minute conversation about something, and there is something else when the story goes on and on and on.
Well, and I think from a neuroscience perspective, you're pointing out a really important thing, which is that our story, it's like when you were saying that funny thing about, well, it's just the client's story. It's like, well, our stories are who we are. That's who we are. But when we tell a story again and again without any change, to me, this is critical. Without any change, without any new insight, without any new awareness, it's just the same story. I think about, I'll throw my grandma under the bus, and she's passed away now, but my grandma was still telling the story about this girl in high school who was so mean and terrible, and that's why she would never use that particular name, because this girl was so awful. And there's no new insight, it's just the same story. And I think what that starts sounding to me like is, it almost sounds like the client pushed the button on a tape recorder, and
Yes.
out comes the story, and it's not useful or insightful, and it only serves to kind of shore up a view of themselves, which could be as a poor me, or a victim, like that. And so then I think I want to do something to kind of reroute the story, because the more they tell it, the more it becomes real to the brain.
Well, and it just, as you said, it just reinforces the same narrative. And so this is sort of what I was trying to say in terms of repetitive. I mean, if a client tells a story once, that there is some value there, and we can talk about why that is. But if that story gets repetitive over and over again, particularly if it's related to a specific person or a specific topic, then it will just reinforce the same thing.
And it's, I think about neuroplasticity. The more we do something, those neurons involved in what we're doing become on alert and quick to fire. So the more we tell a story in a particular way, which may not be serving us, the more ready it is to go. And that's why I feel like it's like pushing the button on a tape recorder. This is just your story about that. And it doesn't allow choice or flexibility. And I think that's why we might want to intrude and say, might want to help them with a process of reframing, of saying, totally, how are you looking at this thing that happened, getting fired from your job? How are you looking at it right now? It's unfair. It's terrible. They were, I'm the victim. It always happens to me, all of that. And is there, going through a process of helping to say, what are other ways? Not because one story's right and another story's wrong. It's just when you get locked into a story, which happens through repetition and that neuroplasticity, it's like that wiring gets super strong. But if we can break that up so there's more flexibility and you can tell a different story, often you reduce the stress and you give the client has more choice. Maybe it's also true that they hated that job, and this is a great opportunity for them to do something they finally want to do in their life, even if it was unfair. And
Well,
if you have that story, that'd be worth empowering.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of a client that I had many, many years ago, talk about the comfort zone, this neuroplasticity that becomes a comfort zone, even though she had other narratives about this person. But every now and again, she would use this old narrative as a sort of an excuse of not wanting to do something. It happened to be, her mother, and it was, well, my mother, she told me for many years this and this and this, and it was interesting for me, even though that she had found other ways of doing it. Every now and again, this narrative would come back in.
Yeah. So I think there's a place, as you say, sort of, to intrude, to come in, to basically, I don't think it's nice or kind to a client. That's just your story, but to find gracious ways to intrude, to say, sounds like you're seeing it this way. Maybe we could explore some different ways of seeing it. What's the choice that you want to have? What would be possible if you didn't have that narrative about yourself or about the situation, things like that, because it really the story can keep us from having choice. And I think in that case, not just going with this, sitting there on the phone and listening to the story, I totally buy that. So let's talk about when should we be listening to the client's story, and what are the aspects of that story? What are the qualities of the story that we should be listening to as coaches? What do you think?
I think there are a couple of different levels, a couple of different viewpoints. So I have one client that is a verbal processor. He is very aware, but telling the story is part of his way to make sense of things.
He needs to hear himself say it.
He needs to hear himself say it. He needs to have me as the receptor of that story, so that when he's done telling the story, I can say, here's what I'm hearing. So
yeah, so not just to process it, but to listen to. Yeah. And there's some really cool research out there, like just having a good listener improves your brain health. So it's not just there's a speaker receiver that you're pointing to, that for him to both say it, but also be received. And then you can pull some things out.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so absolutely. So that would be, one layer.
Verbal processors.
Yeah, a verbal processor where it's really useful, and and it's also knowing your client. You will have clients that are more verbal processors, which they just need a little bit more room and a little bit more time.
Yeah. Where if you intervene right away, you actually cut themselves off from the process of sense making. Can I speak a little more to sense making?
Go ahead. Yeah.
So for me, I think one of the big things that really disrupted my sort of, stories and all of that was also the work that we've started doing with trauma. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that I realized with my trauma clients is I needed to give them a lot more room to tell a story, and actually for them to tell it more than once.
Yeah.
I was like, why am I spending so much time just listening to these excuse me, these stories. And I'm not afraid to, I mean, I've been a coach, taught coaching, you know, I got a coach for 22 years. I'm not afraid to intrude. Why was my intuition telling me, let them tell the story? And what we found as we looked into it is that because memory gets disrupted when you are going through in like an abusive relationship or a traumatic incident, is that the memory isn't super clear. And it's almost like every time so it relates to the verbal processing and the sense making, they would tell the story and the pieces, it's like, they were like, oh, there's another piece.
Yeah.
I hadn't, oh my gosh, until I started talking with you, I totally forgot about the time he locked me out of the house. Oh my
Yes.
God. Or I have had people say to me, oh, this was really interesting, like say to me, you know, everything was really great in our relationship up until, you know, for the first 10 years. We had a great relationship. It was awesome. And then we had kids and then it all, you know, and then I started thinking he was a narcissist. But when I've gone back and said, tell me some of the things you remember about early in the relationship, the client has gone, oh my
Right.
God, that was a false belief that everything was great for 10 years. It wasn't. This is true from the beginning, and my brain had blocked it. So
Yeah.
the telling the story is like finding the memories.
Yeah, well, it makes absolute sense because I think it becomes very fragmented. You know, there's little pieces that are sort of floating around the surface that we unintentionally and unconscious, but often as a defense mechanism, really, you know, the brain, you know, blocks that out. And when we tell the story, all of a sudden, these fragmented pieces, they come more into view.
They come more into view, and it's like, and if you are working with an active listener like a coach, you're making sense of them and you're pulling out what's relevant so that it can be sort of polished and, you know, said like, this feels like a really important piece of the puzzle. Like you got locked out of the house like that. Like, isn't that interesting that you forgot that? That's an important piece of the puzzle. You know, how did you feel? What did you do about that? Let's use that to make some sense. So it comes in as a really good piece of everything that then the client can claim and own and work from.
Yes.
And we should probably say, I mean, this is not a whole video around just coaching around trauma, but one of the things that we teach and that Ursula and I are both very thoughtful about in our own practice is we're only doing this with clients who have a very strong, what we call observer mind capacity. So they can be an observer of their process. It's not too distressing to talk about these things. It doesn't put them outside of their capacity to make sense of it. Because if it does, then we refer to therapy. But if they're just wanting to make more sense of things,
absolutely.
It's totally fine for coaching. And the last thing I want to say about that is even clients who have a very strong observer mind there still can be pieces missing that it can be really go like, oh my gosh, isn't that, oh, that's right, that happened. Oh, that can help them make sense of their lives.
Well, and I think a story told from that perspective can also really keep them in observer mind. It can also, what I found when I have a sort of a traumatic incident, like for example, many years ago, we almost got killed on an icy highway by a really, really nasty weather and all kinds of things were happening. I found myself telling that story again, because what it helped me do, it helped me actually get me in touch with the emotion of that moment. It helped me get in touch with how scary that was, how upset I was, all the things that I couldn't be present in the moment because I was in the car and couldn't freak out.
No, that's such a good example. And it helped you move that through. And I remember seeing, so my kiddo is 27 now. This is a long time ago, and yours are grown-ups too. But I remember hearing at the time, 27 years ago, that there was some research that women and often couples, I think, had this desire to tell the birth story. And if you've ever been around someone with a new baby, they want to tell you the birth story. how many hours they were in
Yeah.
labor, and, and oh my God, and who called or didn't call, or what happened,
Yeah.
and how, and all of that. I think it's very similar to what you're talking about. It's to process it.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody were to say to me, 27 years later, and what was your birth story? And I'm like, I don't know. I was in labor a long time, and then we took the baby home. Like I don't have it's processed, it's discharged.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I think for the first year or so,
Yeah.
I wanted to tell everybody my birth story.
Well,
You remember
it's
that?
so it's so funny because we were with a whole bunch of young couples this last weekend for an outdoor barbecue, and many of them had 9, 10, 12, 18-month old, and as it will happen with little kids around, the birth story came up, and I found it fascinating. So you've just given me the answer to this curiosity that I had. Is like, yeah,
Well,
I need to relive it. I need to relive
I
that.
need to discharge it. I
Yeah.
need to be
Yeah.
witnessed. I need to be seen. And, I remember when I broke up with the man, left the very toxic relationship of the man that I was with, who was on the sociopath scale. It was, there were a couple of things that I remember about telling that story. I needed to tell that story. I needed to get it out of
Yes.
me and make sense of it in the process. And there were two reasons. One was that I felt like I was in a state that is called derealization or depersonalization. It's a psychological state where and I hope if you're watching this, if you have experienced it, you know what I mean. And if you haven't, I hope you never do, because it's really weird. It, like, literally, I felt like I was walking around in a movie, because what had happened to me was so abrupt and like not where my head was at. And all of a sudden I'm in this Hallmark movie with this dangerous person who I thought was my soulmate, and then realized, no, he's actually really dangerous. So that was just weird. And I had to like tell the story to figure out what was real, to like validate, to be like, am I crazy?
Yes.
Like, tell me. There was that aspect. And then I also remember thinking, now this has been, I left him in 2019, so it's going on 5 years. And I would say for the first 2 years, maybe a little longer, you can check me on that. If I ran into someone or, connected with someone who I hadn't seen for a while, I felt like I had to tell them this. Like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened to me. I was with a narcissist. Like, I felt like you couldn't know me unless I told you. It was so significant what had happened. I think that's the birth story. It was so significant. It wasn't even about discharging the trauma. I mean, that was an aspect of it, but it was like, this is a big thing. I have to tell you about it.
Yes.
So all of those factors together. Now it's 4.5 years. I will tell that story. I have no problem telling the story, but I noticed the compulsion to tell it. It's discharged. I don't need to tell it.
A different energy, and I think we can hear that from our clients. There's for a better word, there's a different energy to the story, which again, I think points to the discharge of these emotions, observer mind. But I also think, correct me if I'm wrong, but also sometimes I think we tell these stories because we hope that it will also help someone else.
I think there's that. I think there's, number one, I was like, am I crazy? I don't think I'm crazy. Like, what happened? Like, let me validate, let me check this. Like, what is this? And help me understand. There's that. There's also you will not know me unless you know this big deal thing that happened to me.
Yes.
Right. And then there's the using the story as I do now, like on my blog or here or like you just told the story of being in the accident. It's also to say, now I don't have any needs of my own, but if it's a useful story to tell, now I'll tell it. So I think for my clients, like my clients who come in with big things, doesn't even have to be trauma, but just big things, like a big, like a big layoff I worked for Cargill as a coach years ago, and they went through, there was a big unexpected layoff. And everybody needed to talk about that, like
Yeah.
tell the story. It wasn't just talk about how they feel. They needed to say, yeah, no, it was Friday and I got this letter and then I called 6 people. They needed to tell the story.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. Working with a couple of clients that are in organizations where negative and toxic politics are going on, I can hear their need to pull out these different fragments that are often different people in the same movie, where they can't make the connection why this person said this and this person did that. It gets very fragmented. And I think by telling the story, it gives them a little bit of clarity how the puzzle pieces fit together.
Yeah. And then what I would say, I think that's really good. Then, for me, if I'm working with someone who is, needing to make sense of something, needing to discharge something, needing to I needed to integrate the story into who I am. That was part of feeling like I was in a movie. I needed to bring it into me. And I needed people to witness me as I did that. I think for me, then the check as a coach is, are they having new insights as they tell the story? Are they being pointed in new directions? Is there a therefore?
Yeah.
Or is it on a loop?
Yes.
In which case, I'm not going to listen maybe more than 1.5 times. If it feels like they are not, becoming more integrated with their story. But it just becomes an anecdote or like a party story kind of thing. Like that's then where I might want to intervene.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting, where we started, you asked, where in coaching, is it useful and where is it not? I was sort of reflecting that really in many ways, storytelling is part of our natural humanness. We pass history and knowledge along through storytelling. And so not to tell a story feels somehow
weird, and how do we learn
weird and wrong, which then takes me a little bit to this. We are also told as coaches not to tell our story.
I was just going to go there.
Yeah.
No, let me just say something about like human history, and then I want to hear what you have to say about that, because I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, like, how long has it even been that we've had a printing press?
Exactly.
Or that being able to read is commonplace, and there are still cultures where it's not as commonplace. I mean, this is like a very recent thing in human history, 100 years, couple hundred. I mean, commonplace that everybody can read, or that we have ways of sharing, but the ways we share are often stories. TikTok, you pick up TikTok and somebody will say, a girl will be putting her makeup on and be saying story time, and we'll be telling some story, and that's how we learn. But the only way we had to learn was the oral tradition. For most of human history, almost like 98% of human history, if not 99%. That's the only way we had to learn, is through the stories we told each other.
Yeah. And so there is this aspect for us as coaches, where our own history, the story of us, can also be very valuable if it helps the client to understand themselves better, to have an example that shows them, this is normal. This is not, I'm not crazy, because this person, my coach, whom I trust so much, has gone through something similar, or they have an example of how this has unfolded for them and what they learned from it. So that can be very, very useful if told in a short and well said manner, where the context and the topic, is a match, and where it's not sort of pointless.
Well, I think what you're really pointing to, and I agree 100%. To anybody who's ever worked with me as a coach, and if you don't like this, don't ever work with me as a coach.
Yeah.
I tell stories.
Yeah.
I tell stories, and not
Same
only
here.
stories about me, but I'll pull a story. I'll pull a Zen story out if it feels appropriate. And I always check with my clients, like, do you know this story? Because it's not about me. And they're like, no, I've never heard that. And if I feel like it can really be helpful to illustrate what they're dealing with, I will take 3 minutes of the coaching session and tell that story. But I think that the key is it's really, and you really said this, it's like, is it for the sake of the client? It's not the client who comes on and says, oh my God, we just had the craziest family vacation to the Grand Canyon. And I say, oh my God, we once had a crazy family vacation to the Grand Canyon. And oh my God, and my mother got stuck at the bottom. No, that's what friends do. And a good friend would wait to hear the other person's story first anyway. But if it's a way of saying, yeah, this reminds me of something, and let me, would it be helpful to hear about a similar experience?
Yes.
And then I think as coaches, our job is bottom line it. The minimum we can say that gets the point across, that has the client connect. It's almost like we take the ball away for a minute, be like, okay, let me just tell you this, but I'm going to, super bottom line. And then I'm going to give it back to you. How is that helpful? Is that helpful?
Yeah. Well, and it's also, related to either expertise or your own wisdom. For example, I have a client who just moved, across continents with 2 little girls who are just adjusting to a completely new language, new lifestyle, new climate, new everything. And, this wonderful young mother is, obviously having some struggles. And I have been in that situation. I know what that is like. And so I briefly shared the story of my struggles, but also how we overcame it. And it was really wonderful because she looked at me and she said, that was so helpful, because I think when we tell each other a story, we recognize each other.
Yeah, we see that it's a universal experience. And I think this is one of the things you and I both really got excited about neuroscience when we first started studying it. And even to this day, is there's this way, I like to say, neuroscience kind of neutralizes things.
Yes.
But you can see how I think about, as I'm coming out of this crazy relationship with this insane person, and I'm like, am I crazy? And you can start seeing, no, no. This is the science, and science can be a story as well. Let me tell you the story about a research study.
Yeah.
That is a story that's useful too. That shows that is a typical response. And here's why. Oh, that's information that I didn't have. And if I can make it, personalize it so that another human being can show they had this response and got through it. Sometimes my clients will even tell me, I hired you because I know you've been through this and I know you got through it.
Yeah.
So that tells me I'm kind of a walking story.
Yes.
Like, I'm the story of that you can live through this, right? And actually come out stronger.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, no, that's very inspirational.
Learn.
Yeah, totally.
So I think the bottom line is it's always for the sake of the client's growth, discovery, development, whether they tell stories and they need to tell them to fit pieces together, or you tell a story that is for the sake of some, benefit to them. We feel like stories should be in the coaching world, and we should acknowledge that we do this and that it's not a bad thing, and we're not bad coaches when we do it.
Yes, that's a really, really good wrap up and a really good bottom line. You are not a bad coach if you tell a story that helps your client and vice versa. So.
Right. Exactly. All right. Thanks,
All right.
Ursula.
Thanks,
Really
everybody.
Thank
you, and take care.
Bye.